So with Martin Luther, we're dealing with one of the most unlikely of the great Christian theologians. He doesn't fit the stereotype. He's not a great office holder. The only job he ever holds is as professor of theology at an obscure Eastern German university. He's frankly fat. He's much more of a sensualist than great Christian theologians are supposed to be. He can be positively foul-mouthed at times. His use of language is really shocking to modern eyes. He's open in his celebration of his enjoyment of his sensuality. He's a great beer drinker. He openly celebrates the fact of his being married. He's not the first great Christian theologian to be married, but maybe the first one to really make a point of it and to celebrate it in that sort of public event. And he and his wife together become icons of the perfect Protestant family. You'll find their portraits side by side in good Lutheran homes. So what I want to do is lay out a little bit of how this unusual and unlikely man came to stumble into the position that he did, and to become convinced himself and to convince many others that he had been sent by God to reform and to renew the church and to see it through what he thought were going to be its last days. It's a very medieval story. He's very much a man of the Middle Ages, born in a moderately prosperous Saxon family in the 1480s. His father is a miner and is choosing to set up his son in life with the fortune that he himself has made by sending him to university, and he's going to become a lawyer. I mean, this is the kind of thing that ambitious parents do for their children down the ages. And so he sends young Martin off to university and he prospers, and then disaster strikes when he's 18 years old and something, again, tremendously medieval happens to him. He's caught in a thunderstorm at night. He's terrified. This is all from his later autobiographical reminiscences, some of which are, we have to ask questions about, but it's the story we've got, and the fact that this is the story he chooses to tell us is interesting anyway. Anyway, the story is, he's caught in this thunderstorm and he's terrified. It's at night, he thinks he's going to die, and so he makes a vow. He makes a vow to St. Anne, to the mother of the Virgin Mary, promising that if he survives, he'll become a monk. And he does, and he keeps his vow, to his father's horror. All that expensive legal education up in smoke. He goes off and joins the Augustinian order, fashionable, scholarly monastic order, and apparently hates it. He finds the struggle of monastic life to begin with tremendously difficult. Not so much the discipline, but the confrontation with his own sinfulness that this life involves. This is a rigorous existence of prayer, of penitence, of study, but he finds that instead of coming to terms with and overcoming his own sins, the more he confronts them, the more he's sunk underneath them. He later says that if a monk could ever have saved himself by monkery, it would have been him. Very Luther kind of thing to say. But instead, all he's able to do is convince himself of his own sinfulness and the utter distance between that and God's righteousness. His superiors, recognizing the drama that this novice is making about himself, pack him off to university to study theology. And he goes to Wittenberg University eventually, where he takes up a teaching job in 1511. And that's where he remains for the rest of his life. As I said, it's the only job he ever holds. Pat Collinson, one of the great historians of the period, says that for Luther the Reformation happens between lectures. Other than a few brief periods away, he continues to lecture in biblical studies for the remainder of his life. And during the course of the following decade, we don't know precisely when this happens, if there was a single event. Between 1511 and 1520, at the very latest, he has a breakthrough. He comes out of this spiritual despair, this sense of being unable to free himself from his own sins, and breaks through to a completely different way of believing. It's something which he, in those later reminiscences, describes as his tower experience. And sometimes that's taken to refer to a literal moment that happened in a room in the tower of the Augustinian church in Wittenberg. Sometimes it's seen as something much more metaphorical, that he's fond of using a tower as a metaphor for God. One of his most famous, best-loved hymns begins, "Our God is a strong tower." So whether this was a real event or something that he's constructed metaphorically, we don't know. What we know is that he tells us that he's reading Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1, and comes across a verse which he'd read many times before and which might seem very innocuous: "The just shall live by faith," verse 17. And he says that at that I felt the gates were opened and that I'd straightway been admitted to paradise itself, which may seem a slightly odd reaction to this straightforward verse. But what he finds is that this opens up to him a completely different way of understanding what it is that God's love and God's justice means. God's justice, he had up until then always seen as something which could only condemn him. He knows that he is a miserable sinner. The more he confronts his sins, the deeper they seem to be. And the circle he's caught in is the conviction that God will punish him for these sins, and God should punish him. He cannot deny the justice of God's punishment. What he recognizes through his reading of Scripture, above all through his reading of St. Paul, crystallized for him by his encounter with that verse, is that God's justice is something which can also rescue him, that God's justice can be given to him as a sinner, so that he can be rescued from his sins despite almost because of his utter unworthiness for it. And of course, when a scholar and theologian has an intellectual breakthrough, what he does is put it in his lectures. And this is what Luther does. He spends much of the middle part of that decade thrashing out these issues, and we can see them, because we have these lectures, we can see him beginning to tease out these ideas and what they might actually mean for Christian living. And for much of that time, it looks as if this is simply going to become one professor's private theological breakthrough. Many of the ideas that he's having around this are not particularly outlandish. They're picking up on ideas which are there in the atmosphere. But then in 1517, a set of different events come together which turn this private spiritual breakthrough into a public crisis. And there we need to back up and explain a little bit about what's going on in the wider world, the wider church at this point. So the church in late medieval Europe, which is sometimes caricatured as being dreadfully corrupt and overcome with difficulties, and of course it was corrupt and it was overcome with difficulty, the church always is, but in many ways it wasn't in such bad shape. There are problems, there are difficulties. In particular, the papacy in the late 15th century has been going through a fairly rough patch. But there's an enormous amount of energy and renewal within the church as well, enthusiasm for new movements, newly invigorated piety. The church is doing what it's done so many times in the medieval period before, which is to generate renewal from within itself. And one of the liveliest of these movements at the time is the set of broad, disparate movements which we clump together under the misleading term humanism. Misleading because nowadays humanism is taken to mean secular atheism, which is very different from what it meant in that period. Humanism in the 16th century context means something more like the study of the humanities, as we would say today. It's a movement which does begin as a secular one, coming out of Italian politics and scholarship, looking at the rediscovery of ancient languages, Latin, then Greek and Hebrew. But the rediscovery of Greek and Hebrew in particular has obvious importance for Christians as they're beginning to access the biblical texts in the original language. And the broader ethos of humanism, which is to return to original sources, to simplify, to move to a clear ethical Christianity rather than complex ceremonial, which is of course entirely in keeping with the significant strands of Catholic piety, are something which fits very nicely with that wider humanist movement. So the great intellectual battle within the churches in the early 16th century is between this movement for humanist scholarship, which is pressing for a simple piety, emphasizing good scholarship, good learning, ethics, rather than ceremonial and wealth. The contrast between wealth as corrupting and poverty as meaning simple ethical living is important in this. So that's one of the great battles